infectious diseases, research, medicine, health. Welcome to Outbreak News Interviews. And now, broadcasting from the Outbreak News Skylar Studios in beautiful West Central Florida, here is your host, microbiologist and editor of OutbreakNewsToday.com, Robert Harriman.
Well, hey everybody, this is Robert, and welcome to Outbreak News Interviews. Now, on today's show, I want to continue my discussions with experts on the measles situation in the U.S., and vaccines and the anti-vaccine movement, but I also want to look at some other issues like the Ebola outbreak in the DRC. Well, joining me today to look at these issues and more is Rob Cohen, MD. Dr. Cohen is a physician, board certified in preventive medicine, an Army veteran, an international development worker, and the host of the podcast Democrises. Dr. Cohen, welcome to the show, sir.
Thanks for having me.
You bet. Well, as you know, the hot health topic in the U.S. right now is measles and the issues of not getting yourself or your children vaccinated. Let's start with just some of your general thoughts on what's happening in the U.S. today with the measles outbreaks.
So my general thoughts are we could eliminate measles. We have a great vaccine. We've had it since the 60s. We have eliminated smallpox from the world, and we're very, very close with polio. So we could do this. Unfortunately, for the last 20 years, there's been a lot of misinformation on the internet about vaccines. And unfortunately, in that situation, doctors often just get on TV and they, scold parents just to vaccinate their kids. And they never say how we know that the misinformation is wrong, that vaccines do not, in fact, cause autism, as has been pushed for a long time, the scientific data behind how we know that. And then also, I think we even know parents an answer for where autism does come from. So I'd like to talk about that research as well, because we actually have scientists have been looking into this for a long time, and we know the answers to these. They're just not always winning the court of public opinion because the misinformation merchants are fighting very hard. Right,
yeah, and we're definitely going to get to that. I'd like to get your thoughts on the personal, philosophical, religious exemptions concerning vaccines.
Well, again, I think I don't live under the weather myself. They stem from the broader misinformation. People are scared about vaccines, and so which they shouldn't be, and so they look for an excuse. And they, you can say, well, I have a religious exemption, but there are very few religious exemptions that I'm aware of that are really grounded in like religious doctrine. I'm not aware of where it says in the Bible, for example, that thou shalt not, inoculate oneself against the measles. Measles didn't really hit humanity until about 1100 AD. And so there's documented cases of the first case of measles, which probably came from a cattle virus. And so I think that it's because of the misinformation. I think that the politicians have basically decided to let it go instead of fighting this battle, and I understand why. But again, I think if we can get out in front of the information problem and explain what we know about vaccines, how we know that they're safe, replace that false belief with a true belief about where autism really does come from, we can not only make progress on this front, but we can make progress on reducing the autism front, as well as this progress on the information problem and all the misinformation in our society more generally.
Right. Can you talk about the scientific evidence that vaccines don't lead to an increase in autism?
Right. So this was originally put out by a British physician in 1998. It was later emerged that he stood to make a fair amount of money from suing the vaccine companies. And his initial case series was only 12 patients. And, that's no way to push a study. But so when he put out this theory, however, that the MMR vaccine might be linked to autism, based on his case series of 12 patients, the medical community took it very seriously. And what they did to take it seriously, they first looked at every child born in, it's called the Denmark study, every child born in Denmark from 1991 to 1998. And anybody can read this study. It was published in the premier medical journal on earth, the New England Journal of Medicine. And so they looked at these 537,000 kids that were born in Denmark during this time. And you can simply look because they have almost perfect perfect medical records there. So you can see how many of the kids were vaccinated. Vaccination then was optional in Denmark, so it's a perfect case study. And how many of those kids got autism? What was the risk? Was the risk higher or lower? It's a perfect test case. And what they found was that the risk of autism in kids that never got the vaccine was actually 8% higher, although not statistically significantly, than kids that did get the vaccine. And that alone just completely disproves a link, because if there were a link between the two, you would not see almost any cases of autism in the unvaccinated group. But in fact, you saw a slightly higher risk in that group. And so that led, of course, us to believe, well, okay, well, if autism doesn't come from this, where does it come from? And I could tell you the studies that give us some answers to that.
Well, let's go ahead and continue with that. What does cause autism? What do we know to date?
So it's using similar methods. We can figure out the answer. I'll tell you the answer in a minute, but it's broader. It's called the two-hit hypothesis. So you have to be genetically predisposed. That's the first hit. And then you have to have some environmental damage. And so it's just like cancer. So smoking causes cancer, right? But not every smoker gets cancer. So why? Because there's a two-hit hypothesis. You have to have the genetic predisposition to cancer, and then you have to have the environmental insult of smoking, and then maybe even a little bit of bad luck. So it's the two-hit hypothesis would be the genetic predisposition and then the environmental pollutant combined with the bad luck. So in the case of autism, there's probably there are many genes that have been implicated pretty clearly. There's way more boys that get autism than girls, which clearly suggests a genetic component. But the environmental risk appears to be several, but the big three I would say are, and this will be surprising to people, maternal obesity during pregnancy, maternal diabetes during pregnancy, and taking certain prescription drugs during pregnancy. And all of those three things have been going up in our society for the last 20 years, which would explain the rise in autism. Now, we haven't proven the link between those two, but it makes perfect sense. The rate of autism has been going up. The rate of obesity has been skyrocketing in our society. And obesity leads to a general unhealthy state. And if it happens during pregnancy, or maybe you get a sugar imbalance from the diabetes while the child's brain is developing, it's pretty easy to see how in a child that's genetically predisposed to get autism, you might have brain malformations, which manifest themselves in a number of ways. Autism often has many different manifestations, but they're all sort of on the so-called autism spectrum. And this tells us that not only should we not be spending this time worrying about vaccines, which help prevent disease, but really it's yet another reason why we need to start getting out in front of this obesity epidemic.
Well, the anti-vaccine movement is strong and getting stronger and really affecting the thinking of a lot of people. Is this really the reason why parents really believe in the vaccine autism link so strongly?
Yeah, just very short. There's a lot of misinformation on the internet. Parents are confused. They want answers. They're really scared of getting autism. And they see these sensational stories of these people that say things that are completely biologically implausible, like, I got my shot, my child got my shot, and an hour later they were autistic. That's just, if you ever meet a child with autism, you know that that's impossible. Right. It's a crazy claim. But in a world that's scary, where it's really hard to understand anything, think about the things we have to understand just on a daily basis to survive, let alone think about the future of our planet. You can understand how a really good con man or a really convincing YouTube video might sway a parent to say, well, I'm just going to avoid the situation because I don't have to worry about measles anyway. The problem is, then we do that, then we get these measles outbreaks. And so I really encourage parents to, let's not, we all know the internet's full of garbage, whereas your pediatrician has 11 years of training at a minimum. So I really encourage parents to talk to the pediatrician, ask them how we know vaccines don't cause autism. How do we know that they're safe? How do we know what does cause autism? And what will happen if my kid gets measles? Measles is a really serious disease. It used to wipe out populations. Mm-hmm. Measles does this thing to your immune system called immune amnesia. This was published in Science, the major scientific publication in the world, a couple of years ago. It appears to basically be such a severe disease that it suppresses most of your immune system, so your immune system only worries about protecting you against measles for a couple of years. So you lose your immunity to other things. So what we saw after we started vaccinating kids against measles is all-cause infectious disease mortality decreased, because not only were you wiping out measles, but you were also making the body more strong to defend against other infectious diseases.
Yeah, and as far as the fatality, yeah, maybe we don't see a lot here, but we can look overseas, Madagascar, the Philippines today. There's plenty of fatalities due to this virus.
There's a big outbreak of measles happening in Madagascar right now, which is a real shame because that country has enough problems. And yes, 1 in 1,000 kids with measles will get severe. 1 in 5, I think, is at risk for pneumonia, which can kill you without antibiotics.
Mm-hmm.
And then 1 in 1,000 will get a severe brain inflammation, and or blindness and death. One or 2 kids out of 1,000 kids with measles will die, even with antibiotics. So, it's a severe disease, and we need to eliminate. If we eliminate it, the estimates are vaccines are one of the few medical interventions that actually save more money than they cost to implement. Every dollar spent on vaccines saves the society between $3 and $10 in terms of disease averted and healthcare spending. And I would really like to spend that resources on other things like solving climate change or something.
Okay, let's switch gears to the Ebola outbreak in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And I understand that you were working in the DRC for, I don't know, is it the current outbreak or the one prior to that?
So this one's been going on for 8 months, and I was there back in November to help with it, and it's still going on. And so I'm going back because it's still going on.
So can you give us a kind of a bird's eye view of the situation there, and where do you think this is heading?
Yeah. So Ebola was a total shock to humanity when it emerged out of nowhere, out of the Central African rainforest in the 70s, this disease that was reported to cause people to bleed out of their eyes and every other orifice and liquefy your liver. Turns out that was a bit sensational. But it's true, about 1 in 5 people will have disruption to their blood vessels, which causes the internal bleeding that Ebola is so famous for, and it does have a 90% mortality rate. So now that we've sort of gotten a handle on this, we even have figured out how you're supposed to stop an Ebola outbreak. We understand it spreads through body fluids, and that means people that have Ebola, you need to isolate them, and people that are in contact with Ebola, you have to isolate them and detect them early if they get symptoms so they can get treatment and so you can stop the chain of transmission. That's a very simple answer, just simple, so-called, very simple epidemiology of contact tracing and isolating cases. That's how they stopped the devastating outbreak of Ebola in Liberia, Guinea, and Sierra Leone in 2014 after it had devastated 3 countries and infected 28,000 people and killed 11,000 of them. So the big fear is that could happen again. It happened once, it can definitely happen again. And the reason we have not been able to get this outbreak under control is because it's unfolding in the middle of a conflict zone. Eastern Congo is the site of a civil war that followed the Rwandan genocide after 3 million Hutus streamed across the border from Rwanda and formed 70 militias and 10,000 fighters, and they've been fighting for 20 years, and 5 million people have died, and they don't really trust the international community to come in. Now they're upset. The international community is all concerned about 300 cases of Ebola or 500 cases of Ebola when they just let 5 million people get butchered with machetes for 20 years. They're not exactly trusting of the international community, and you can understand why. And so we've had difficulty isolating every case. So far, we've contained it to the area, but there's a lot of human suffering as a consequence, and a lot of money being spent. And actually, so we have a podcast as well. I'm pleased to be on yours. We have a podcast, and we're going to have a mini series on the Congo in general and all the challenges that it's coming out soon. We'll release that hopefully in a couple of months. It's called the Democrises Podcast, and maybe we'll talk about that more later. But people that are interested in the Congo can check that out.
Yeah, and speaking of that, I mean, you were there, I take, as a physician. Did you feel that your life was in danger in working among this conflict zone?
So the U.S. government right now actually doesn't let our people go to the conflict zone. So we're coordinating through our partners that are allowed to go to this dangerous area. So that is a big challenge. The United Nations doesn't have all the capabilities that the United States does, especially in terms of military force. They have some. I mean, the UN forces are doing the best they can. But there was an attack to clear one area where 7 African special forces were killed in a firefight with militants. That was public. That was back, I think, in November. The media outlets, the media reports can be found online. It's nothing that's not publicly known. But it's really hard. And so we can work with the government in Kinshasa, but there was an election going on as well.
Right.
And that government has its own problems. And so, no, my life wasn't in danger, but going to that area is not easy. And it's just like going into any other war zone. You know, you just don't do that alone and expect to just come out okay on the other side.
Yeah. Now, I believe it's still experimental, but they're using an Ebola vaccine over there. Can you talk about that and what success we're seeing?
Yeah, so I was in Kinshasa, the capital, on the other side of the country.
Gotcha.
Okay, so and that's where I'm going back to. So at least for now. So the vaccine. So I'm always a little suspicious of a new vaccine. Vaccines don't always work. Supposedly, this one that was released in 2014 in the Sierra Leonean outbreak. Supposedly, the reports were it was 100% effective. Now, there are very few vaccines that are 100% effective. And so I was a little skeptical of that. So we are using it. So they say it's, quote, experimental, but it probably is very good at generating an immune response and protecting people. And they are using it, and it's probably helping in this case. But there are some anecdotal reports that maybe it's not as 100% effective, and the virus mutates. Maybe it was 100% effective in 2014, but that doesn't necessarily make it 100% effective today because, viruses mutate. They mutate fast, especially under selective pressure. And so I think we should not count. I mean, the vaccine is great, but we shouldn't count on a vaccine to magically solve our problem. It's also expensive, right? Making this vaccine in particular is expensive, not as expensive as some. So it's helpful, but I think we should have reason to find other forms of prevention, like stopping these outbreaks in the first place or detecting them very early. And the ways that we stop that, of course, we know where Ebola comes from. It comes from eating animals, and we're eating more and more animals as the population goes deeper and deeper into the forest. We really need to get out in front of this problem, the human population growth and the incredible environmental destruction that I've seen not only in Congo, but basically every other country with a forest, such as Madagascar.
Well, you stepped right into my next question. And I understand you were there in Madagascar during the plague outbreak 2 years ago, I think it was.
Correct.
What was that like, and how does that compare to the Ebola outbreak?
Well, so plague is a bacteria. So that's one big difference, of course. The plague can be deadly. Plague wiped out a third of Europe in the Black Death of 1353. It's the same exact bug today that it was then. Now, where does plague come from? Plague is transmitted by fleas, and its host is the rat. And so plague is a fascinating disease that we can get into the history of it if you want. But there have been 3 huge plague pandemics in history. We're living in the middle of the third, which started in China in the 1850s, spread to India, and then spread on boats all across the world, including to the United States. We have cases of plague in Colorado and Montana and Idaho, which infects about 7 people a year in those states. And that's from the exact same plague epidemic that is now also in Egypt and Peru and Kazakhstan and Madagascar. Madagascar reports more cases of plague than any other country on earth. And the reason is because the Madagascar villagers do slash and burn agriculture, where they set fire to the forest and just let it burn way more than they need to. And so the rats flee the forest into the villages and bring plague with them. And then they start plague. So they actually have a plague season in Madagascar where they have a few hundred cases every year, which no other country on earth has, except Congo actually does as well, because of all the burning that happens during the rainy season. And it would be really nice to stop that. And the problem is, so that's just bubonic plague. Bubonic plague are the big boils that everybody's heard of, and we could talk about the physiology. But every once in a while, bubonic plague becomes pneumonic plague, where it goes from the lymph node into your bloodstream, into your lung, and then you start coughing it on people. And then it's spread person to person, not by fleas. And that's what happened in 2017. And so and pneumonic plague is 100% fatal without antibiotics. You need antibiotics very quickly so it doesn't destroy your lung. And so that caused Madagascar to go into a panic, devastated the country, caused the government to lose a lot of the confidence of the people, cost a lot of money, caused a lot of human suffering, ultimately infected between 1,000 and 2,000 people. And this is yet another example of environmental destruction causing a completely preventable tragedy.
Okay, well, I want to go ahead and close with this. I want to give you a minute or two to talk about your new podcast, Democrises.
Thanks, Sue. So, so just like all these other cases, we look at the world and we are concerned about what's happening, whether it's democracies that are unable to meet the challenges of the 21st century, or whether it's overpopulating human societies, or whether it's corruption among our leaders. So we're trying to confront what we call the three global democrises of democracy, demography, and demoralization. And just like the topics we talked here, we use evidence and history, and we believe that there are answers to these things if we can just find them in the millions of papers that have been published. And so our first season, we just released 13 episodes on how to fix the crisis of democracy, which is infecting not just the United States, but many other countries. And just as an example, we go through some ancient societies that seem to be at their peak, such as Qing Dynasty China and ancient Greece, ancient Athens, before they quickly deteriorated. And we also focus heavily on solutions. So my favorite story is the Teddy Roosevelt episode, in which we talk about how Teddy Roosevelt confronted an America that was facing many similar challenges to today: rising economic inequality due to massive technological change, vicious partisan hatred, tons of misinformation. And he was able to solve pretty much all of it and launch the American century. And we tell the story of what his secret weapon was in order to achieve that. And that's just one of the 13 episodes that we're proud to have recently released. Democrises, you can find it anywhere.
Well, perfect. And for listeners that are interested, I will put a link to the podcast on the website when I publish this podcast. And I want to thank you, Dr. Rob Cohen, for sharing your thoughts and your experiences and your expertise.
Robert, thanks so much.